Welcome. Welcome. This day belongs to you, graduating students. Let's begin with the first of many rounds of applause for your triumph and your graduation. You graduating students of Hampshire College, you know well that we take pride in your accomplishments and we rejoice with you today. I think we should also recognize some folks without whom you would probably not be graduating. First, let us recognize the faculty and staff, each one of them, who've helped you reach this point. Let's give them a generous round of applause. Let's be sure also not to forget to thank your parents and families, without whom you will not have made this journey. Indeed, without whom that enthusiasm is well justified, because without your families, your friends, would have not begun this journey, and they have been gracious enough to let us form this community where we've learned from one another over the past years. This is a day of applause, of laughter and joy, but it is, of course, also a day for some farewells. Last night, the Board of Trustees honored the service of 4 outgoing trustees: Tim Kohler, Jerry Warburg, Professor Falcone Sheth, who served a 2-year term as faculty trustee, and Matan Cohen, who also served 2 years, the first as student trustee alternate and then a year as student trustees. In a moment, I'll ask you for applause to thank all of them, but I also want to have in that applause all the board members, continuing, newly elected, as well as all of you, faculty, staff, and students who serve on the many committees at Hampshire College. Thank you. We also say goodbye to several retiring faculty who have for many years guided students and shaped Hampshire with their deep wisdom and passion. Frank Holmquist, Judith Mann, and Stan Warner. It's inspiring to hear. I've met with Frank, Judith, and Stan. It's inspiring to hear what they have planned for their lives and how they'll be part of the community. Indeed, Stan Warner has moved into the house next to mine, and I know he'll come over and check out my closet and give me some sartorial advice for which he's so famous. 40 years ago, Hampshire was preparing to welcome its first entering class. 40 years ago, those now legendary interviews had already taken place, at the outcome of which Hampshire was the most selective college in the States, and also an opportunity for our alumni of that class to tell those stories for years and years. We'll be gathering here in mid-June to have a great party in honor of our 40th, June 11th to 13th. I hope you'll all consider coming, and it's going to be a fair where dozens of Hampshire alumni display their wares, an alphabet of achievement from arts to music and food and products, and all of their creativity. Please come, please pre-register if you plan to come, and you can check it out on the alumni website. Each year, I have a deeper and greater sense of what is so special about Hampshire College. This year has had its challenges, much in the wake of the severe economic downturn that we've all experienced and from which we seem, and maybe only seem, slowly to be reemerging. Even if some economic signs improve, they're troubling questions. Why is it that the largest financial institutions are made whole, while tens of millions of individuals who have lost or never had anything or jobs are not given any help, or if they are, it is begrudged them? Why are millions of families losing their homes to foreclosures? These are altogether wild and even frightening times, as evidenced by the protests in the streets of Athens that led to the loss of life, to civil unrest and coup d'etat around the globe. It is striking to register the extent of protest and violence in Thailand, since Bangkok, at least, had seemed so tranquil for so long. From a distance, of course, one should never equate peace and quiet with peace and justice. Even more, it reminds us that being safe for a tourist does not equate with safety for the inhabitants of a country, the majority of whom are poor. If there's any kind of peace now, it has been, alas, purchased with blood. I know that many are in solidarity with the movement for justice and democracy. That is important. Chairman Roos already alluded to ecological threats. There's the appalling disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, now even exceeding the Gulf. By no means a natural disaster, since it arose from a technical failure of a BP drilling rig. This unstopped gusher, far worse than the Exxon Valdez disaster, spotlights the extraordinary environmental risks our entire system of extracting petroleum and natural gas involves, so that every step of the way, our well-nigh global addiction to carbon-based sources of energy harms the world. We cannot at this point tell how great the harm will be. We know it will be vast. A calamity for entire ecosystems, organisms from single-celled to humans around the Gulf and beyond. If this is the point at which we stop taking these risks and get serious about demanding and funding the oversight of private enterprise, some good might come of this, even if it's too late for many. Will we really have and maintain the will to make long-lasting systems change? If so, it will be only if we can convince more and more of our fellow citizens around the world to be like Hampshire students, like you, to study the science, to study the policies, to study the politics, to study hard realities, to be critical, to stay involved, and to maintain a dialogue. This is a time of anger, also politically. Ever since President Obama brought forth healthcare reform for debate, temperatures have been getting hotter and hotter in Washington and around the country. Is there a political warming comparable to global warming? Debate is even more strident and partisan than it was running up to the presidential election, and that had already seemed to set new standards for stridency and partisanship. The longest running recession since the Great Depression, the collapse of the housing market, and the implosion of credit, leaving foreclosures and bank closures in their wake, and continued high employment, this all makes for a yet more superheated and explosive atmosphere. Particularly through the healthcare debate, we've all watched the destructive works of the politics of no, the rigid discipline of an opposition that very nearly put a stop to the momentum for healthcare reform itself. We have observed the techniques, negativity and resistance right from the start to protect existing privilege. Look at the debate on the so-called public option. Opponents of a single-payer system, even as an option, managed to keep the ball so far from midfield that the scrimmaging is all at one end of the field. I hope I got that right. It's always a risk when I try out sports metaphors. We witnessed the twisting of messaging and heard the falsifications. We watched appalled, at least I did, at the way certain phrases took on a zombie-like life of their own. The infamous death panels, as if folks aren't already having their healthcare options policed, restricted, and denied by insurance companies now. And not that we need a further example of absurdity, but remember the folks who simultaneously feared any changes to their Medicare program and argued that no government-run health program could possibly be any good. Let's remember how easily it is for folks to be swayed by cleverly manipulated messaging. If you repeat a falsehood often enough, it's long been observed, many people will believe it. Of course, we know that anxiety about changes to our healthcare program is not the whole story. It didn't take long for strong indications to emerge that President Obama's parentage had something to do with the animosity that is frighteningly rampant in our country. His father was not merely black, but African, a Kenyan raised in a Muslim family. Even before the healthcare reform became a lightning rod issue, there were the birthers, folks who claimed President Obama wasn't born in the United States and hence wasn't eligible to be president. Legitimacy questions, in other words. There were yet others who argued that Chief Justice Roberts' bobbling of the oath invalidated the inauguration ceremony. These folks just couldn't tolerate the fact that Barack Hussein Obama Jr., an African American, was the duly elected and inaugurated president of the United States. For this vocal subset, his presidency seemed a zero-sum game. Whatever accrued to him, to his difference, took away power, diminished privilege. That he was a highly educated, well-spoken gentleman with degrees from fine universities, including a JD from Harvard, only made matters worse. I don't know whether it's a comfort or not, but for a host of reasons, maybe it's my training, maybe my temperament, but I often turn to history. No, I'm not going to go back to the classical world, and I'm not going to get medieval on you. In fact, my talk is long, what else is new, and time's short. I would simply urge one and all of you, at some point in your lives, perhaps sooner rather than later, to look into the famous, or rather infamous, Dreyfus affair. The affair that embroiled France from 1894 to 1908. Now, it would take many lectures simply to chronicle the series of events, betrayals, cover-ups, and forgeries within the Army and intelligence services, as well as the other outrageous miscarriages of justice in multiple trials, with laws passed with retroactive effect, suppression of evidence, intimidation of judges. Any single one of these episodes seems incredible. The totality simply beggars the imagination. Alfred Dreyfus, as many of you know, was a Jewish officer who had earned top armies in the French military. And while France prided itself on one level of its official tolerance of Jews, anti-Semitism was rampant and indeed on the rise in these years. It was a fire that a nationalist and reactionary press was only too happy to add fuel to. And the country and the army in particular were still smarting from the ignominious defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Once evidence emerged that some officer was passing or selling information to the German embassy, it was only too easy to pin it on the one Jew among top-level officers going through a circuit of training in the high military commands. And once that accusation of espionage and high treason became attached to Dreyfus, it was impossible to dislodge it. It was axiomatic for the accusers that this was an assault on patriotism and the army, and it seemed obvious to them that the Jew, the outsider, was the likeliest traitor, since once the narrative had been launched, it took on a life and perverse logic of its own. Prejudices were only confirmed. As one aristocratic embassy secretary noted in his journal, and I quote, "The officer charged with treason is a Jew, Captain Alfred Dreyfus. His indiscreet curiosity, his constant snooping, his air of mystery, and finally, his false and conceited character in which one recognizes all the pride and all the ignominy of his race have made him suspect for a long time," end quote. What evidence did not exist was confected out of thin air, and entire dossiers were created and submitted by the prosecution in secret to the judges without sharing it with the defense, a procedure absolutely prohibited even in France's judiciary practice at the time, including military tribunals. The prospect of a second court-martial unleashed a new wave of forgeries. One forgery was so blatant that when it came to light, the high government official committed suicide. Scandals of that nature and the tireless championing of the cause of justice, first by Dreyfus's brother Matthew, and then a growing army of defenders, the Dreyfusards, most famously the novelist Émile Zola, eventually led to the nullification of the first court-martial and a second court-martial, which was suborned, then a pardon, and finally official exoneration. Zola's letter to the nation, J'accuse, stands as one of the great examples of political journalism of all time. In it, Zola purposely put himself at risk for libel in order to bring to public scrutiny the entire prostitution of justice the initial court-martial was, as well as the deep corruption and self-serving, rank-closing bloody-mindedness of the military class that could produce such a miscarriage of justice. I urge you then to take time at some point to read about this complex affair. If you do so, you will not merely learn of one of the great episodes of modern anti-Semitism, and there were riots and pogroms with Jews killed and injured in the wake of publicity of these trials at the threshold of the 20th century in France. You will find yourself also unsurprised by anything occurring on our political stage today, whether Tea Party or right-wing demagoguery, the media sideshows of cable network commentators and bloggers, and the degree to which politics and interest intrude into oversight agencies and the very courts themselves. Perhaps the most heartbreaking symbolic moment was the public degradation of Alfred Dreyfus on January 5th, 1895, in the courtyard of the École Militaire. By degradation, I mean the stripping from Captain Dreyfus of his military rank and of his arms. That's the literal act of unranking or degrading from which the word degradation comes. It was then always a wonder and a tribute to Dreyfus's true patriotism and his love for France, even after and over and beyond the act of treachery, betrayal, and justice, that once he returned from Devil's Island, he eagerly took back his uniform and ultimately his stripes. Dreyfus was then vindicated, and thanks to courageous writers like Zola and Jean Jaurès, we know what went wrong. Political and judicial reform starts from the revelations of injustice. The Dreyfus affair stands, thanks to them and all who continue to study it, as a warning against intolerance and judicial abuse. Graduating students, you have comparable courage. You vigorously champion the cause of those who are downtrodden. Remember, the truth will out, and it is always right to pursue it. Remember that we are all, despite moments of disagreement, even passionate disagreement, one community, and together we celebrate your graduation and congratulate you. Thank you.